Leader of the third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to rise and speak to Budget 2018. You know, Honourable Speaker, it's refreshing to see a budget that puts focus back on people, and for that, I and my caucus colleagues are very, very welcome. You know, the government has provided an excellent range of tools in the budget, but what matters, Honourable Speaker, is the details. And while we have yet to have had time to explore in further details what the actual implementation that we'll be discussing when we debate Bill 2, Budget Implementation Act, at this stage I'll say that we're quite reassured that clearly at front and center in government's mind is an approach towards starting to think, which has been missing for some time, about intergenerational equity, about doing today what's good not only for this generation, but also for the generation afterwards. You know, British Columbia has lost ground on earnings since 1976, 4 decades ago, on average by about $8,000 to $10,000, while at the same time, the costs of housing and living costs have skyrocketed. This budget focuses on 2 critical areas, one being childcare, substantive investments in childcare, and the other being in the housing. I'll come to both of those separately, discuss in detail what we like and don't like with respect to the housing initiative, talk about our confidence in supply agreement, and as well as talk in detail about what we do and do not like about, well, actually, frankly, there's not much we don't like about the direction that the childcare policy is moving forward, and we'll be quite clear in our support of that. You know, one of the things I'd like to see at the get-go, as we move towards actually embracing the idea of intergenerational equity here in this legislature, is that future budgets should start to report age trends in terms of government spending and revenue for those over 65 and those under 45 and those in between. Why this is important is when we start to look at it in this particular budget, we see that, for example, Medicare gets a substantial increase, a dramatic increase, to the tune of $832 million. And that's 3.2 times the investment, the new investment in childcare spending. The 2018 budget once again grows by spending faster for seniors than for the youngest British Columbians. If you actually do an analysis and do a cost analysis, on average, every senior gains $421 in new spending in this budget, while each person under the age of 45 gets a mere $261. Now, I'm not saying we're going to criticize the overall budget, but what I will say is that we need to start reporting out the data as per the age groups, because as our demographic, as our baby boomers age, there's a concern that we'll continue to throw more money after health, more money onto the healthcare system, while neglecting some of the issues, profound issues facing the next generation. You know, we need to start thinking about that generation a little bit more, and I'll come to that when I discuss the climate plan, or lack thereof, as detailed in this budget. In BC, there has been a growing inequity between those who have and those who don't have. Those who don't have compounding problems with costs that have been rising for them. Fixed costs like MSP, fixed costs like ICBC rate if they're required to drive, and so forth. And let me start by saying, with respect to MSP, we're delighted to see that government has taken steps in that direction to eliminate MSP in the coming years. We do have some concerns, shared clearly, as we heard earlier, with the official opposition, that the plan to actually eliminate MSP precludes the actual submission of the final report of the committee that was struck and designed to advise government as to the plans it should do to eliminate MSP. It seems on the one hand you have a committee, and on the other hand you've already prescribed an outcome. With that said, we understand the rationale that government is taking for what members opposite have called a jobs tax. It's not a jobs tax, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, right now in British Columbia, most major employers have negotiated benefits with their employees. Those benefits have negotiated contracts. Those contracts, very often, more often than not, include a negotiated benefit where the employer pays the MSP premium. That benefit, when it was negotiated, and I say that as someone who's acted as the chief negotiator for University of Victoria faculty 2 times in negotiating, that benefit that is negotiated is costed against a settlement. It's a cost that would otherwise have been spent with workers in that organization on other issues. So the approach that the government is suggesting, while clearly going to meet some confusion and resistance, is one that is done in other provinces. There's a recognition that as we move from a system where employers had to negotiate this benefit with employees to one where employers are likely going to pay about the same amount in many cases as they are already doing, perhaps some a little more than others, but now instead of it negotiating in future cost settlements, it's part of the cost of doing business. Now, we recognize and understand the concern that this came out of nowhere. You know, the BC Greens in the last election campaigned, of course, on eliminating MSP through mirroring the healthcare premium, progressive healthcare premium that we see in Ontario, which is one that actually has the person paying that, and that would also have been able to be a negotiated benefit. And again, I won't have time to go into the details of why we favored that approach as one that retained revenue, but did so in a progressive fashion. Please let me start by highlighting some numbers on what clearly is the defining issue in British Columbia as we speak, the issue of affordability in terms of finding a place to live, either through ownership or through renting. Since July of 2017, at which point the BC NDP formed government, we've had some increases. We've had, from July to January, a 4% increase in the cost of condos in the Capital Regional District. We have had in the Lower Mainland, from July the 2017 to January 2018, a 10.1% increase in the average cost of condos to now an average of $665,400. In Victoria, it's $450,600 on average. So while we have been waiting for government to deliver and offer a plan on housing, the prices have gone up in the CRD by 4% and by 10.1% in the Lower Mainland. In question period today, Honourable Speaker, I was somewhat troubled by the answer I got when I posed a question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs on Housing and asked what she meant in her plan when they talked about the issue of stabilizing our housing market. Is stabilizing meaning we're going to stop at present values? Does it mean we're going to slow the development of the increase? Does it mean reverting back a little bit? Frankly, Honourable Speaker, I don't know many people who could afford an average condominium price of $650,000 when the average salary is substantially below $100,000 for a family, in the order of, I don't remember the exact number. But I will say this, that the housing component of the budget, while recognizing at least finally we have a government realizing there's a problem, is not the bold action that we were looking for, but rather a timid approach towards dealing with a problem that frankly I don't think will be dealt with through the actions that are put forward. You know, I obviously welcome many of the steps that are in this, but when you have revenue projections in the budget for this year and future years that require substantial amounts on the revenue side to come in from the property transfer tax and the speculators tax, you start to recognize that, in fact, this is not dealing with the problem. The whole purpose of a speculators tax is to reduce speculation, to set us on the path towards there's a very little amount of revenue coming in from that, because speculators are no longer in our market to the extent that they are now. But government hasn't budgeted that way. They've budgeted $200 million remaining flat in that regard. And that, to me, Honourable Speaker, is worrying. What I see, if I stand back and look at the housing aspect in this budget, what I see is government viewing this as a cash cow to create revenue for which they can deliver on their affordable housing supply side plan. That is, we're going to continue to allow speculation, foreign speculation, money coming in from everywhere in our housing market. We'll tax it a bit more, and we'll use that as a source of revenue to build affordable housing. It doesn't deal with the problem, Honourable Speaker. The problem gets bigger and bigger, and we're trying to actually put a Band-Aid by creating other aspects of, by creating supply that will not address the fundamental problem. You know, Honourable Speaker, right now in British Columbia, real estate, leasing, and renting, those three things, real estate, leasing, and renting, accounts for 18% of our GDP. 18% of our gross domestic product comes from real estate, leasing, and renting. You know, government has clearly recognized the substantial component of our economy associated with such sector, and rather than recognizing that this is unhealthy, it's viewing it as a source of income to build for the future. Let's take a look at some of the specifics in the policy. In terms of stabilizing the market, one of the things government is proposing to do is to tax speculators who are driving up housing costs. Now, the annual charge will be 0.5% in 2018, which is clearly a barrier to nobody. 0.5% speculation tax in 2018, moving to 2% in 2019. The first question I have is this: why would you do 0.5% in 2018? Why would you start so low? Why wouldn't you increase that? If you wanted to have a transitional one, why not 1% in 2018, 2% in 2019? We're not sure where that number comes from. Now, we recognize that there's upfront exemptions for long-term rental properties and so forth, and for most principal residences. But I'd like to outline a number of problems that I see with this speculator's tax approach. Number one, we all know, everybody in British Columbia will know, friends and family who live in the prairies in the summer. That is where they grew up, that's where their home is, but they recognize for financial reasons, for other reasons, they may be elderly and it may be unsafe to walk around in the cold, that they want to live in a warmer part of Canada during the winter months. And so they might have a condo in downtown Victoria, or in Parksville, or in Nanaimo, or on the Sunshine Coast, or in Kelowna, an apartment that they spend 4 months a year in, a primary place to live. And that these people now will be subject, if things go ahead as I read it, to a speculator's tax. They're not speculating, Honourable Speaker. They're living there for 4 months. They're contributing to our economy by buying food, by buying electricity, by spending their money in our stores, by buying music, by buying records. I buy records. Others might buy records too. Those are the vinyl ones. Yes, I do. Sadly, I sold my records and then I buy them all back. But that's another story that we won't go into today. That's the problem, Honourable Speaker. There's also British Columbians. There's British Columbians who may, for example, have a condo on Mount Washington. They might have a condo on Big White. They might have a condo in Apex or some other ski resort, Silver Star. Honourable Speaker, these are not speculation. In many cases, these condos are given to friends and family if they're not being used. And I have troubles and concerns that this will be treated. Honourable Speaker, this budget is missing what the real problem is. The real problem, we all know what it is government is afraid to take it head on. The real problem, Honourable Speaker, is offshore money flowing into our market here purely in terms of speculation, purely in terms of an investment to use our housing stock, our land, as a commodity that can be traded or bought and sold, much like potash or gold or wheat or natural gas or oil. Honourable Speaker, housing is a place for people to live, a place for people to rent to others, to vacation to. It is not something that we should view solely as a speculative place to dump, and heaven forbid launder in some cases, as we know, offshore capital. We know that jurisdictions like New Zealand and Australia have stepped in and dealt with it. We know it was successful in Australia. We know Prince Edward Island stepped in and dealt with this years ago. We know that jurisdictions all across Europe have stepped in to deal with this. Some in much stronger measures than others. Like in Denmark, you must live in Denmark for 5 years before you can own property. And the reason why is quite simple. When you are a stable democracy, particularly one in the most beautiful parts of the world, your land, your capital, is viewed as a safe haven to park money. There are 4.6 million people here in British Columbia and 7.6 billion people in the world. There's an awful lot of millionaires in the world looking to park their money in safe havens. They could stick it into offshore bank accounts in the Bahamas, or they could stick it into real estate here in British Columbia. And as we've seen highlighted in many of the stories, whether it be through the Kathy Tomlinson's good work in the Globe and Mail or Sam Cooper's good work in the Post Media, there's an awful lot of shenanigans going on in terms of money transfer into our market here. And that's what we should have dealt with. That's why we put forward our bold plan for housing action, not the hashtag timid plan that we see here before us today. That's not to say that there aren't good first steps here. There are. I say hashtag for all those people at home riveted to this who are live tweeting out our budget response here today. You know, again, I come back to that. I worry that government is treating the speculator's tax as a form of revenue as opposed to actually dealing with the problem. Why is it we're afraid? I know after we introduced our hashtag bold action plan on housing, the public support was overwhelming. I have never seen public support at that scale like I saw for that issue. Recall about 3 years ago when I stood here calling for the elimination of MSP, and we initiated a campaign for public support, and all of us in this House were inundated with emails about people who felt it was a regressive one-size-fits-all tax. All three parties campaigned on eliminating it. The response to the foreign or offshore capital ban makes that response pales into comparison to the response that we saw with respect to the call for foreign buyers. When I say foreign buyers, it's people who don't pay income tax here or in Canada. And again, government's collecting the data to know who they are, because government is now going to have the speculation tax based on where you pay your income tax. So again, if you're going to have the speculation tax into where you're going to pay your income tax, you're putting in place the structure to actually collect the data to know where people pay their tax. It's very simple there at that stage to say, if you pay your tax and you're not paying your tax in Canada, or you're not a Canadian resident who happens to be posted in some other jurisdiction, but you're actually Canadian, you should be able to own property here. But we don't think it's right for somebody sitting in an office tower in Luxembourg to recognize that they have a windfall of $1 billion that they need to actually park somewhere. So let's park it in land in British Columbia. That's fundamentally wrong, because it ends up increasing the costs for all British Columbians. That Luxembourg office tower is not, when they invest, is not paying the social costs associated with affordability. They're not paying the food costs associated with affordability. Honourable Speaker, I have delegation from Northern BC come and see me when I was at UBCN, profoundly troubled by what was going on in there, with thousands of hectares being bought up by foreign corporations and converted to produce hay, not for British Columbians or Canadians, but to freeze-dry that or vacuum-pack that hay and ship it abroad. What is the social cost of doing that? Well, the price of hay goes up in the area because much of it's being shipped, number one. And number two, access to land goes down and prices go up. So we end up paying the consequences of not dealing with this foreign capital flowing in. And frankly, I think government has failed on that aspect of dealing with the housing issue. The government response is to say, let's increase the foreign buyers tax. Okay, another policy instrument that you have. But again, in what can only be described as one of the greatest examples of whack-a-mole, the government proposes to move it from not only Vancouver region, but into CRD, Nanaimo, and the Okanagan, central Okanagan. Well, I can tell you, as a matter of certainty, what's going to happen here on Vancouver Island is it's going to have zero effect on the input of foreign capital. But I will say that Cowichan Valley Regional District, in between Nanaimo and Victoria, is going to see a massive spike in property. Parksville, Qualicum, Comox, Courtenay, Campbell River. Just watch what's going to happen up there on top of what already exists in these communities in terms of housing. You look at the Okanagan, well, good luck Kamloops. Watch what's going to happen there. You know, you can't play whack-a-mole on an issue like this. There needs to be a policy solution that is broadly applied across British Columbia. We increase the buyer's tax from 15% to 20%. Again, what's the signal it's sending? It's saying we're going to generate more revenue from those who are buying. The interpretation I have on that is that government is seeking a source of money to build the affordable housing that they plan to build, but not actually take steps to deal with the problem. It's a little bit like a child's story that I read, and I still read today to schools when I go in. It's a story about a king who likes cheese. The king likes cheese so much that his castle gets infested with mice. The book's called The King, the Mice, and the Cheese. Well, the king doesn't like these mice, and so what he does is he calls in his wise folk, and they tell him, you know, what are we going to do? And they say, well, you know, we have the solution, the only solution. Bring in cats to get rid of the mice. Bring in cats to get rid of the mice. So the king does that, and his castle gets infested with cats. So what do? Wise folk come in and advise him to bring in dogs, which get rid of the cats, but you're left with a dog problem. So they bring in lions to get rid of the dogs, and you're left with a lion problem. They bring in elephants to get rid of the lions, and now you have an elephant problem. So how are you going to get rid of the elephants? You bring mice back in to get rid of the elephants. Now you're back where you start. And so when I do this with kids in class, the metaphor I usually attach it to is climate change. But this metaphor actually applies directly to housing, the housing plan here. I ask the kids in the class, what do you think the wise folk are going to do now that they're back where they started? Invariably and in unison, the children will say, stop eating the cheese. But that's not what the wise folk do in this story. They decide that they have to share the cheese with the mice. The analogy with climate change is direct. The adults can't give up what they're doing. The kids say, stop using oil. Now, in the case of housing, it's exactly the same thing. We know what the problem is. The problem is eating the cheese. The problem is offshore capital. And rather than dealing with the problem, we skirt around it with all sorts of this and that and others and whack-a-mole here and policy over there and second guess over here, and we're not actually dealing with the problem, Honourable Speaker. You know, again, I look forward to exploring some of this in Bill 2 when we debate that at some point in the future. Another component of their plan, another component that is odd, is increasing property purchase tax on the value of homes over $3 million. That's less odd than actually the increasing school tax on houses over $3 million. Now, I get that, you know, this acts as a little bit of a barrier to sales of homes at above that, and it puts a little clamp on. But again, it's not a bad step for tax fairness from the property transfer tax point of view. It's kind of scary when we're one of the very, very few jurisdictions that we have property transfer tax, that we are relying so heavily on revenue for that to meet our general revenue targets. It's a little scary that we are hoping that this windfall continues. But the real problem is the school tax. And the reason why that concerns me is that there are many people who, for no reason other than the fact that they live in a house that they live that's gone up in value, will now be required to pay substantive increase, or 3%, or an increase in school tax. It's small, actually, I forget the number, but an increase in taxes, which they otherwise would not have to pay if their home wasn't valued so much. Now, I know we can talk if it's seniors who are living in the home, and seniors can defer their property taxes until such time as the house is sold. But I can tell you, Honourable Speaker, of personal stories that I know of individuals whose parents died. And those individuals whose parents died were living in the home. It's the only asset they have. They've grown up in the home. They might have special needs. They might need a little bit different support. They're barely struggling to make ends meet, but they have a home to live in. Now, for many cases, you might argue, well, they should sell the home and find another. That's not always possible for people. And so here I worry that by broad-scale taxing, again, on everyone for school taxes, we're not actually dealing with the problem. We know what the problem is. If you want to reduce the cost of the homes, deal with where the money's coming from, and that's from offshore. You know, I do like the fact that there is some legislation being brought forward to, and from a tax fairness perspective, it's quite good, to allow cities to regulate Airbnbs and the likes of that. But again, it's not dealing with the problem. The problem is the growing amount of our supply that's used in a fashion to actually have short-term vacation rentals. Again, we could empower much more interesting ways of doing this by requiring business licenses, tourist, slightly different zoning restrictions, and so forth. And I would have hoped that we'd have more discussions on that. To the issue of cracking down on fraud and closing loopholes. Now, my expectations were extremely high here in this area, and I was profoundly disappointed in the lack of action that I saw in terms of the actual closing loopholes. The government's response is, we're going to collect data. Now, okay, I recognize that collecting data is always a good thing, but the reality is we know that there are loopholes. We know right now that there are people who are actually going into partnerships and avoiding foreign buyers tax by having one of those partners a Canadian and the other one of a partner who's not a Canadian. We know that's ongoing. In fact, if you want to know how to do it, all you've got to do is read the Chinese language signs on bus stops in Burnaby or Richmond. They'll tell you how to do it. We know that these are being abused. These are existing loopholes that are there. We don't need to study them more. We need to close them. The Bear Trust loophole that the now Attorney General, when in critic, was pointing out time and time again needs to be closed. Government response, collect the data, study it, maybe something in the future. A crisis requires bold action. A crisis does not require standing back, reflecting upon it, and then maybe making a decision down the road. If we look at, some of the registry issues are good, the requirements to have accurate data. Again, the pre-sales offshore, we're requiring developers to collect information on pre-sales. That's not dealing with the problem. The problem is we know that condos are being pre-sold in offshore markets at below the amount they can actually are being sold for here in British Columbia. So rather than collect more data, we should be closing those loopholes. And I'm saddened that the government did not take the bold action that would have led to us doing that. I worry in terms of auditing and enforcement powers, although there's discussion here that in fact the budget does not have the staff required not only in enforcement and compliance in the housing issue, but also in all other sectors, whether it be environment, for FLNRO and others. We see an increase in civil servants, but the discussion of that increase is not containing language about the need for more compliance and enforcement staff in these areas. And in terms of the ALR, the Agricultural Land Reserve, I'm dismayed that government has not taken steps to limit foreign speculation in the ALRs. It's out of control now. And again, the foreign buyers tax, you put it in Vancouver. Honourable Speaker, I'll be designated on this. I see the green light has come on. In Vancouver, we know that the foreign buyers tax put a temporary damper on single-family homes, but people just park their capital in agricultural land in Delta. They park their capital in the interior. They park their capital in condos in Kelowna. They parked it in condos in Victoria. We should have been closing the Agricultural Land Reserve loopholes in this budget, and really delay is not an excuse. Again, it's refreshing to see that there will be some language, or there was some language about working with the federal government to protect tax evasion and putting in place permanent provincial federal government action to combat money laundering, tax evasion, and avoidance. These are obviously good first steps in addressing tax fraud and money laundering to ensure that governments have the necessary information to enforce real estate taxation, but they're not adequate on their own. We were looking for far more substantive action. Where are the people? Where's the budget announcement that there will be an increased number of people enforcing these rules here in British Columbia? Where's the funding in that regard? We find that starting in 2019, why not 2018 in July, but starting in 2019, the province will collect SIN numbers, social insurance numbers, as part of the homeowner grant application process. We know that there is some fraud going on in homeowner grant applications, and it's good to see that there's enforcement there. However, again, this is but a small but important step in terms of dealing with the overall plan. The government continues to focus, Honourable Speaker, continues to focus on, much like the former government did, the issue of supply. Somehow, if we build more, we'll solve the problem. Again, I can tell you, every time I drive to Vancouver along Cambie Street into town, I can see that, there's a lot of construction, large land assemblies going on. If you go to Burnaby, Metrotown, lots of high-rises going on, lots of them being built, lots of vacancies in them. And what's happening here is you're displacing low-income renters, or the townhouses and the duplexes on Cambie Street, which high-end condos and townhouses. This is not dealing with the issue. Again, if we dealt with the offshore capital coming in, we'd temper that. It's not only happening there. You can see the land assemblies in downtown Kelowna. They're happening all over downtown Kelowna. You see the land assemblies happening in Victoria. These are land assemblies that are happening to change what's typically lower-end rental housing with upper-end condos. Now, that's not against condos, but we need to have a plan, a bold plan to actually deal with our housing crisis, rather than a whack-a-mole plan and put Band-Aids on little areas of it, which is not actually getting us to where we need to go. It's also, there are some other good things. Of course, I was pleased to see that partnerships are being built on the area of affordability. The housing hub is an interesting idea, particularly in light of the fact that it's being funded by the removal or the elimination of the BC Home Partnership, which clearly was an utterly outrageous plan brought in by the BC Liberals to incentivize those who cannot or barely qualify for a mortgage to take on more risk than they should otherwise take on. What sort of economic principles were they building their policy on? The economics of causing bankruptcy is basically the plan. I guess they were concerned about not enough people having foreclosures, which is why the government wanted to incentivize foreclosures. The fact that the government introduced those when the last government was here was frankly a reckless approach to incentivize purchases with people who couldn't otherwise. So I'm pleased to see that the government's eliminated that. It's using its home, it's creating something called the Housing Hub. It's an interesting idea, an organization that will partner with NGOs and others to actually look about ways of funding and moving forward with affordable housing. So that's a good idea that we could support. And it's also interesting to see that the municipal and regional district revenues are going to be able to be expanded to actually be used for affordable housing. It'll be interesting to see how that goes, but there will also be some concern that municipalities will take that as somehow being downloading of federal jurisdiction or provincial jurisdiction onto municipalities. I was looking for other things that we didn't see in the housing aspect of the budget. We didn't see a tax on flipping. We know, everybody here will know somebody or some other people who what they do is they go into a home, they're there for 6 months and one day, they move to the next house, they're there for 6 months and one day, they move to the next house, they're there for 6 months and one day. There should be, there are means and ways that we can actually step in to ensure that houses are treated as places to live, not ways of avoiding capital gains tax, which is basically what's happening there. We also noticed that there was no ability for local governments to tax empty homes. Now, jurisdictions across British Columbia have said they want the ability to tax vacant homes, if they so choose. In our, what I like to call, #bold action plan on housing, as opposed to #timid step plan that we see before us, was actually to empower municipalities, without bringing the House back, to enable them to introduce vacancy taxes or, frankly, foreign business buyers tax if you didn't have a foreign buyers ban in place. But again, we didn't see that there. If we look then, in general, I like to give letter grades. You can take the academic out of the university, you can't take it out. It's like the speaker. You can take the teacher out of the classroom, you can't take the classroom out of the teacher. Letter grades on this housing plan, C. Not a very bold housing plan. The member from Powell River Sunshine Coast has requested a meeting in office hours, and we will do that after. And the member from Chilliwack has suggested great inflation is occurring here in British Columbia. So that's a good sign, Honourable Speaker. If I have both extremes, it must be like me. It must actually be a fair grade that's been offered here too. I want to move to childcare, because while I'll give a C to the housing plan, I'll give a high A+ to the childcare plan. It is an exceptional plan. We would have. Thank you. You know, the building of childcare and early childhood education system presents us with an unparalleled opportunity to provide the next generation of British Columbians the best possible outcomes for success to set BC on the path forward. We've heard a lot about, you didn't say $10 a day. But as we've said all along, and if you actually look at the policy embedded in the $10 a day plan, you see it coming forward right now. What matters in British Columbia is good public policy. And we see that brought forward in this very innovative approach to childcare. A historic investment in childcare. Mind you, had we had a BC Green majority government in this legislature, there would have been an even more historic investment, as we had campaigned on over $4 billion over 4 years through sources of revenue that we have identified as where we would have collected. $4 billion over 4 years and $4 billion in education over 4 years. Because if you want to make it a priority, you can make it a priority. It's clearly a priority to this government. There's no question. You know, we know that the first years of life are a phase of prolific neural development. MRI studies indicate 80% of all neural connections are formed by age 3. It's also a time when children's brain development is highly influenced by their environment, and infants, toddlers, and we know For infants and toddlers, research quite clearly suggests that they are capable of complex thought, and their development at this stage can impact the course of their life. We know that there's broad consensus that children who have access to high-quality, affordable childcare enter adulthood healthier, better educated, and less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. These outcomes contribute to a long-term health, happiness, and higher earnings, as well as higher tax revenues for government and reduced government spending. That's why in our campaign, we recognize that the single most important investment you can make in any society is in early childhood education, childcare, and K-12 education system. Because if a child gets off on the right start, you don't need to provide the services, the social services, the housing issues, the fentanyl crisis services down the road, and you save money by investing up front. While this is a good step in that regard, we look forward to see how this actually plays out as we move forward. Without any doubt, this is critical, this childcare plan. And as we had in our confidence supply agreement, we argued that what's important to both parties in terms of shared values was an investment in childcare and early childhood education to improve quality, expand spaces, increase affordability, and ensure childcare is accessible for all families with a focus on early childhood education. One of the things, Honourable Speaker, that's clearly missing in this is a recognition that one of the barriers to effective childcare and early childhood education is access to people who are actually going to work as early childhood educators and childcare providers. The reason why it's missing is we talk about investment here in the budget in terms of training new people. That's great. But if you're going to offer these trained new people minimum wage, which is not much different in many cases, it's hard for these people to want to aspire to go into the career of early childhood education or childcare if they're not earning a wage, if they could earn a better wage, being a waitress, working on a construction site, building a house. We want to ensure that when we have professions in our society that are so critical, teachers, early childhood educators, that we attract the best and brightest into that field by valuing it as a society and ensuring we pay them what we as a society believe they deserve. We saw that missing in the budget. We didn't see a focus on how we're going to actually raise the wages of people to encourage people into this area. We talked in the budget, we see language about increasing more spaces. That's good. Increasing more educational opportunities. That's good, but we did not see substantive discourse on how we're going to increase the wages there, and that's what we look forward to. That's still an A+. It's not there, member from New Westminster, and if it were there, I would be delighted to see it, but we don't see there any statement about how we're going to actually increase the wages of these people, because you can say that okay, we're going to give families some more by allowing them access, but again, it's about the wages of the people there in order to get the people to actually be early childhood educators. The focus here has largely been on childcare too. There's some language on early childhood education, which is important, but we need to recognize that not every family chooses to put their children in childcare. There are some families who believe they make the decision that the husband or wife, or husband or wife, one of the partners will stay home with the child, and the other partner may go to work. Now, in my colleague's case, Adam Olson, member from Saanich, take his name back, hashtag remove. My colleague from Saanich North in the Islands stayed at home with his children. He stayed at home with his children. And society doesn't value that. One of the things we campaign for in our platform was recognizing that childcare is a choice. For many families, the choice is they'd like to have high-quality licensed services where they could have childcare occurring and education occurring through childcare. For others, the choice is to stay home. And we believe that fairness would require both to be treated equally. Fairness would be that you actually, when we campaigned, was to create a benefit for those people who so chose to stay at home. So it's not to incentivize third-party childcare, but also to recognize that for some, staying at home is an option. That we would have liked to have seen in this budget, and I see some of the members opposite are in agreement there. At least one of the members. Okay, but I suspect, well, there's only, two of the members opposite, and there's only, I can't say which, and there's only, I can't say there's not all members opposite are there. 33% of the members opposite. Readers at home. So 3 years from now, Honourable Speaker, some single parents currently paying $1,250 a month for infant and toddler care will pay no fee at all if their income is below $45,000 a year. That's great. That actually gives those parents who so choose to put their children in childcare to actually have the ability to do so. It doesn't deal with those parents who choose not to, and therefore it's incentivizing more people to choose to put their children in childcare. We all know, Honourable Speaker, the single best care a person can get is with their family. And many, many parents choose to actually, one person stay at home. Many cases, some people choose to have a nanny to come and live in their house with them. Again, that would not be accounted for here, because in that case, you know, there's an option that people have that would not be rewarded here too. Maybe it's a grandparent who comes to live, as most, many Eastern European, my family, South Asian communities, Asian communities, part of the family structure is that as the children age and have their own children, the grandparents play a key role in that tight family unit of looking after the grandchildren. That's how my children were raised. I suspect that's how members opposite, I look to the member from Delta North, that's how his children, he was raised, and maybe his children, is that the grandparents looked after our children. The grandparents stepped in. It's a very common cultural value. We're not actually rewarding that here. We're looking for, we recognize that there's some home-based licensed childcare, but not everyone wants to take in other kids as well. The grandparents might want to come and look after the kids. And frankly, we think that they should be rewarded. They should be rewarded because they are providing a key service, generating some income perhaps. But in this system, the service is much more expensive if it's done elsewhere, and that's what we're incentivizing. So there, I mean, with that said, there's no question we support this plan. We think it's an A+. But there are things that I think that have not been thought. And last third one on that, and my colleague from Saanich North and the Islands might address, is Indigenous communities, where in fact the model of childcare might be somewhat different from the model that's being thought about here. And we have to be very careful that we don't try to impose a one-size-fits-all option in terms of Well, exactly. The member, I have a lot of time for the heckling or comment from the member from Powell River Sunshine Coast, because he comes from this issue and he's providing validation in many areas here. It's not heckling. It's okay. The member is suggesting it's included. We're having a discussion here. It's not clear to me that I didn't see it, so during office hours, I look forward to having the member from Powell River Sunshine Coast also bring forward the issue of how it's included. The creation of 22,000 spaces is clearly a good. It's putting us on track to where we need to be. And you know, $237 million over 3 years to do so, that's a non-trivial investment, coupled with a major, substantial capital investment as well. Coming to the issue of quality, childcare workers generally, as I mentioned, don't earn pay equity, wage levels. It's a reality. We in society seem to think that if you are driving a truck, you should be paid more than if you're caring after our youngest infants and toddlers. I mean, that, Honourable Speaker, is a messed up society in my view. It's not that way if you go to progressive nations in Europe. Progressive nations in Europe do not share that view. They recognize that childcare, education, is a critical aspect of a thriving, successful society. And I don't see the measures here that I would like to have seen. We need budgets to anticipate that childcare workers should be better compensated. And the budget proposes new investments in post-secondary training for childcare providers, but it is very short on details about plan to raise wages for early childhood educators to be on par, for example, with school teachers. Why do we think it's okay for children in the age of 3 to 4 to be paid, in many cases, a fraction of what children at the age of teachers of children at the age of 5 would be paid? It seems to us that we have some priorities here. Well, you know, if we move then, again, with that letter grade of A+ for the childcare to the issue of climate, another issue that is quite important to me, I'll give a solid B on the issue of climate. There's many A's in other areas that I won't have time to address. I wanted to... I could give you A's on the rent. I will give the government A's on the way they're actually applying the increased funding for renters into the RAP and SAFER programs. Without a doubt, no, that's not an A. That's an A+. There's recognition there that we have. There's recognition that we have federal programs coming in on stream in 2021 that would mirror beautifully with the existing RAP and SAFER programs. It targets people when they need it and who they need it, seniors in SAFER and lower income rental subsidy, people with lower income requiring rental subsidies in the RAP place. So without a doubt, there's an A+ there. I'll give you some more A+ to the members in government as we go forward. The solid B in climate. You know, I appreciate that government is reiterating its commitment to take steps to meet our climate targets. I very much appreciate that. And I very much appreciate that government has sent a signal to the market that the price of carbon, the levy attached to it, will increase by $5 per year to meet the federal target a year before the federal target comes into place. That shows leadership and that shows certainty. It gives business leadership and it gives business certainty. I appreciate that the government is also taking steps to ensure that those people who cannot afford to will have to pay this will have means and ways to deal with it through rebates, much like we have right now with the carbon levy rebate. I appreciate that government recognizes that some industries, you know, like Rio Tinto Alcan, for example, have already made major investments in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. And it's kind of difficult for them to make further investments in light of the fact they've just spent billions of dollars to do that. And there's going to be language in there as steps to ensure that there's no penalty for people who've been early adopters or people who are have taken steps or will be put at a competitive disadvantage if they aggressively move forward. I was saddened to see that we had no mention of bringing back in the cap-and-trade legislation that the BC Liberals repealed when it created its greenhouse gas increase and LNG act back in the day. The cap and trade enabling legislation was a critical component of Gordon Campbell's, at the time, climate plan in 2008. It is what the BC NDP campaigned for back in the day when they finally came up with a climate plan after the Axe Tax campaign. The cap and trade enabling legislation can work in concert with the carbon tax to actually capture heavy industries, to pull them out of the carbon tax, include them in the cap, and then allow British Columbia to join Washington, Ontario, Quebec, the eastern US, many, many states and jurisdictions that have such a plan to allow for the most efficient reductions of greenhouse gases to occur. I would have liked to have seen that, Honourable Speaker. Again, the problem with climate mitigation plans is it's not too dissimilar from the same problem that Indigenous people have been dealing with for years. Words, aspirational goals, and targets are so easy to offer. What matters is real action. We have words in the budget, but where are the actions? There's a general worry that the government's present reconstitution of climate leadership team will give it an excuse to delay action when we know the civil service has spent years, since 2008, developing the instruments, the pathways, the regulations that we could implement. Why did we not see in the budget a recognition that British Columbia should have a zero-emission vehicle policy, like Quebec has? British Columbia should have a zero-emission vehicle policy. Why didn't we see in the budget a statement along the lines as British Columbia will change a small regulation? It could be done through order in council that will actually allow people to charge for electricity if they're charging their charging stations. Companies like ChargePoint, which install electric charging vehicles, or Sun Country, they're not actually allowed to charge for the electricity. And so what we have is we have to wait for the goodwill of schools, the goodwill of hospitals, the goodwill of municipalities or homeowners like me to actually provide free electricity to somebody if they want to charge up their car, unless you're BC Hydro. And BC Hydro has, get this, 29, I'm not kidding, 29 fast high voltage DC charging stations in the province. Now, for a province that claims to be wanting to see leadership in this area, that's pretty woeful. That's more than pretty woeful. It's quite pathetic, really. You can't drive from Victoria to Kamloops because there's no high voltage DC stations, and even the ones that are there are down so often. The stories I get from across British Columbia, station in Kamloops down, Duncan goes down. Duncan goes down for months because they're repaving the parking lot. Well, people who drive from Victoria to Courtenay need a fill up in Duncan or Nanaimo, and they're both out at one point. Like, this is a joke, Honourable Speaker, in terms of what we're saying here. So we want to be we want to be leaders, but we're not willing to invest in the infrastructure. But it doesn't even require public investment. It requires allowing industry to put the charging stations in and actually, for example, charge 35 cents a kilowatt hour, like BC Hydro has been allowed to charge because of an application before the BCUC, which permitted it to charge 35 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. Now, you or I, Honourable Speaker, couldn't do that unless we registered as a utility. Well, there's no way in a million years I'm going to go and register as a utility. New Westminster, the member from New Westminster is here, has a registered utility. They can actually charge for power in New Westminster with their charging stations. Nelson, I believe, is another one. Yeah, I'm hoping it's not in the budget, but I would have liked to have seen more signaling, either in the throne speech or in the budget, because the budget sends a direction. The direction, childcare, A+, housing, C, climate, B, and then there's a bunch of good things in the budget. So I know some of the stakeholders out here in the community are quite excited by what they've seen, but I like to quote Sierra Club, because to me the Sierra Club reaction is quite critical in light of the fact that the Environment Minister, who I have enormous respect for, who I think is doing an incredible job, he was former Executive Director of Sierra Club. And this is what they said: "There's no question affordability is a huge issue for far too many working families, but longer-term affordability issues are being neglected as a result," said Sierra Club BC Communications Director Tim Pearson. Budget 2018 attempts to address intensifying climate impacts, which will continue to get more and more expensive, but does not allocate nearly enough resources to this growing challenge. And it's not only the Sierra Club saying that. We had last week the Auditor General in British Columbia saying exactly the same thing. So to the issue of transportation. Transportation, A-. Transportation, the step forward in terms of the infrastructure and moving towards the direction of the Mayor's plan. Very pleased to see that we're seeing a start down that area. Something that I would have liked to have seen, something that I think is critical, is we should see sooner than later investment in light rapid transit, light rail from Abbotsford and the Valley directly into Metro Vancouver. We know that one of the biggest problems in terms of congestion in Metro Vancouver is investment. We have the member for? No? We need investment. We have BC Transit and we have TransLink. But heaven forbid you cross the boundary and take public transit across the TransLink and into the BC Transit zone, BC Transit being in the Fraser Valley, TransLink being down in the Metro Vancouver region. Light rapid rail, why are we not talking about that in Victoria? Why are we not talking about actually getting people from A to B efficiently, getting people out of the cars? Because if you start to increase, this part of the problem, again, we have with some of the perspective of the climate strategy, is that there is going to be substantive revenue coming to government through rising carbon levy. And ideally, some of that money would be invested in public transportation so that you generate a source of income to provide people alternatives to actually get out of the cars, with the goal that you actually reduce income coming to you through increasing carbon tax and increase income coming to you through people paying to go on public transport. This is the kind of direction we'd like to see, and hopefully, you know, again, there's lots of good stuff in this budget, lots of good stuff for seniors and ferries. You know, finally, we have a government that recognizes that ferries are pretty important in British Columbia. I'm sure my friend from Powell River would agree with that. One of the things that we would have liked to have seen, is a discussion, I recognize why it doesn't happen, a discussion of bringing BC Ferries back into the Ministry of Transportation. We know that there's a debt that would be incurred and it would potentially have issues on credit ratings and all that, but again, it didn't stop government from removing tolls on the Port Mann and Golden Ears bridges, which frankly brought $4.7 billion of debt, which isn't too much below the BC Hydro debt. So it's a question of priorities. Again, lots of roads being built. That's what governments do these days. They build roads, they build bridges. I'm sure the communities that are affected will be quite excited about that. On the topic of building, one of the things that I also think I should have mentioned, and I'm delighted to see, subset of the housing strategy, A+ for this, is allowing universities and colleges across British Columbia to actually build student residences. Thank you. This is critical. We know that students in Victoria, Vancouver, in Nanaimo, in Nelson, in Cranbrook, and Prince George, pick your community, Powell River, are living in basement suites, they're living in apartments in the community. But their institutions that they're attending want to build housing on campus, to bring those students onto the campuses. The students want to be there. And that would free up rental space in the broader market, reducing pressure on rents. But universities and colleges are not permitted to borrow money to actually make the buildings. So this is one of the most important steps that could have been made in terms of an investment, in terms of dealing with supply, is student supply on campuses. And for that, it's actually 100%. There's no A+ there. You got a full home run on that piece of policy from our perspective. So thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you on behalf of University of Victoria, Camosun College, both of whom I've met with, both of whom on this very issue, both of which are in my riding and both of which are just dying to move forward with this plan. And it's the same thing with every one of you in this House, I'm sure, as well. Another A+, Honourable Speaker, prescription drug. A because it's almost there, but it was already announced. It's good to see measures in there, the steps to make access to pharmacare a little more affordable. That's great public policy. The coming back to healthcare again. The healthcare investments are good. We love to see, we're very supportive of the focus on seniors and team-based care. this is the way healthcare has to move forward. Again, the worry, coming back to what I said up front, is if you look at the spending in this new budget, the new spending on the average senior gets $421, and the average person under the age of 45 gets $261. I recognize that you can't fix the healthcare system all at once, and this emphasis on team-based care and focus on seniors is a very fine way of moving forward, nudging the system in a new direction, hopefully cleaning up some of the mess behind, because let me tell you, I'm but one MLA, but I'm sure everyone here has heard from constituent after constituent after constituent with their horror stories about the access to health care, not in terms of the quality of the doctors, nurses, and providers, but in terms of the bureaucratic nightmare that exists in some of our healthcare systems here in British Columbia. I'm concerned about, as we move forward, about access to doctors and nurse practitioners and the ability for us to fund and retain people. I don't think that we recognize, I don't think that as a society we recognize that many of the new doctors and nurse practitioners coming out are looking for a different style. They don't want to be small business owners. They want to be salaried. They want to be able to be salaried, and they don't want to spend one of their 5 days a week filling out papers and doing administration. So again, the focus on team-based care is a good direction in that regard. I hope we complement that with increased access to actual primary care. I had one constituent who got his degree in another country. This constituent is now a doctor practicing medical in hospitals, in emergency rooms in another country. This gentleman wants to come back to his family here in British Columbia. He wants to be able to practice here in British Columbia, and he can't. The only reason why he can't is because he has to go through an entire new education and training program. One of the best ways we can actually get to bring increased capacity in doctors and medical practitioners here is to actually allow those who've been qualified in jurisdictions across the world, in very fine institutions, to be able to practice here. I don't know, how many stories you all have, but recent immigrants that I know who come to my riding, they were practicing medical practitioners in their country. And here, they're working in a restaurant. They get in through our points program, speaking multiple language, but they're working in a restaurant, not because they want to, not because that's, and not criticizing that because, I have family who own restaurants, as the member from Delta North did. In fact, ironically, it was the same restaurant, just in a different generation. But it's to point out that we could actually alleviate some of the pressures if we started to think about how we could better use the Canadians and British Columbians who've been trained abroad, who want to return, and give them ability to do so. The total of $548 million over 3 years provided in the budget to improve services for seniors is fantastic. A+ on that, no question, particularly in the investment in home and community care, which we know is a much more cost-effective way of dealing with that. And the same with the $150 million investment in team-based approaching. We'd like to see where that direction is going. Education, another very solid high rating in education. A solid A, a first-class rating there in terms of providing the resources needed to deliver public education. Again, I'm a little concerned that that the focus here is about building schools and walls and retrofitting. What success in education does not depend on the color of the paint or the type of wallpaper. The success is ensuring that teachers have the resources they need in the classroom to deliver the curriculum in the best ability they have, and that children have the resources and access to the services they need when they need it. So, a story I told in the response to the throne speech. Why is it that we as a society think it's okay? It's okay for teachers to use their salary to buy the textbooks and the resources that are used in the classroom. They shouldn't have to do that. It's not all about paying for playgrounds. It's also about ensuring that in the classroom, teachers have access to the resources they need to ensure that they can deliver the curriculum, and that students also have their access as well. Opioid overdose emergency, another aspect of the budget. Without any doubt, both the previous government and this government are committed to dealing with the opioid crisis in a manner that deals with it from a harm prevention. And from a harm prevention perspective, I would have argued that the BC Liberals and the BC NDP both get a solid A. They both recognize this as a crisis. The problem I have with both is that the focus, the largely central focus on harm reduction, doesn't in the longer term talk about a pathway to a recovery, and in the longer term about a pathway to prevention. So we, had we perhaps, I'm speculating, had we as a society recognized 16 years ago, 15 years ago, that investment in children in our classrooms, giving them the support they needed at the time they needed it, when they needed it would give the social services the resources they needed to deliver the services they needed, we may not be experiencing the harm reduction plans funding we're doing today, because children we know are influenced by the services they get when they're young. They wouldn't be the same children who today are struggling with mental health and addiction issues on the street, with homelessness, etc. So investments early on, as many European nations do, leads to a form of prevention that down the road actually saves society. Again, that's not to criticize the good steps being taken here in terms of overdose prevention. And again, some of this is not unrelated. We see one of the bills, one of the issues raised by the Globe and Mail, Kathy Tomlinson, is the link between the drug crisis and the housing crisis. So many of these issues are not totally separate from each other. We know that a lot of the money laundered through the drug industry is actually being laundered through our real estate issue, and it's good to see that the Attorney General is taking some steps there. Again, good to see continued movement towards investing in higher education skills, training, and the workforce. And in particular, we're very excited with the agreement with young adults, whereby $30 million over 3 years will be put to increase support for young adults aging out of care, a particularly vulnerable group in our society, where the care is used to offset living costs while they attend school. Again, absolutely fundamental investment. In our platform, we proposed applying a basic income pilot project to youth aging out of care. In essence, this is a very similar approach, but rather than calling it a basic income pilot project, what you're doing is, in essence, you're actually assisting youth out of care. And I hope government collects the longitudinal data. Would you like to make an introduction? Or no? A longitudinal data that is required to ensure that we can assess the effectiveness of this investment. There's investments in wildfire resiliency, investments in new agri-food sector. Again, really strong, solid investments that we support. Many of these, I could go on a litany of A's in this area, but there's a lot of these smaller investments that we think are wonderful in terms of the $29 million over 3 years for the Ministry of Agriculture to expand the sector by supporting a variety of initiatives that are part of the Grow BC, Feed BC, and Buy BC network. Again, maintaining transportation network, $36 million there, increased funding for arts. The arts community has been dying for this. 15 million doesn't sound like a lot, but 15 million will certainly have an impact. And having an additional $3 million for Creative BC to promote and strengthen motion picture, music, publishing, and digital media sectors. All of these solid A+. If there was more money, give more money, but we recognize that decisions ultimately have to be made on any particular issue. 45 more minutes? Oh, the member opposite told me I have a full 45 minutes to continue. I see the member from Kamloops South has now come in, joining the member of Kamloops North, Thompson, here, to South North, same thing. Kamloops, the Loopsians are here. The problem, again, coming to the agri-food sector is we don't want to forget that while we promote the agri-food sector, there are also things that I would have liked to have seen cautionary tales being told in the budget and throne speech. We have had a very profound release of Atlantic salmon in south of the border in Washington. Washington have now taken steps to actually remove all Atlantic salmon fish farms from their coastal waters. We don't see a discussion in the budget. We don't see a discussion about budget about any potential costs or benefits associated with doing what we need to do in British Columbia, which is take strong steps to no longer renew the permits fish farms in the wild migratory paths, those are sockeye salmon here in British Columbia. That will be a small loss of revenue on one side, but it'll be a particular gain in revenue in other areas, particularly if we can reinvigorate our wild salmon stocks, our Chinooks, our chums, our sockeyes, etc., through conservation initiatives, through investments in science, as well as restoration of creeks and seasides where these fish spawn. To the issue of Indigenous people, Honourable Speaker, this is incredibly refreshing, and my colleague, I'm sure, Mr. from the Saanich North and the Islands, will speak more to this. The investment of $50 million into revitalization of Indigenous languages is one of the most important investments the province can make, because we know that language is part of culture. And when you invest in language, you're investing in culture. And to me, that will be received very, very well. Throughout, and one of the things I was quite excited about is throughout this budget, throughout the discussion, is that the recognition that we must implement and agree to the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People and implement the calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In doing so, you can't just throw it all in the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs or the Ministry of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation. You have to recognize that there are certain issues in government that transcend all ministries. And this is one of those ministries. And it's very good to see that we have investments in education, in community and outreach, in language revitalization, in housing, a multi-pronged approach to investment in First Nations and Indigenous people in this province who I think will be, obviously I can't speak for them, will be pleased to see a full recognition in this budget, both in terms of the importance of UNDRIP as well as the investment in their communities. Again, coming to the full-time equivalents for the BC Public Service, year after year we've seen cuts to the civil service to a point now that we end up with compliance and enforcement divisions, no matter which ministry, to cut to bare bones. We start to see environmental issues that we spend a lot of time talking about, a lot of money cleaning up, a lot of problems dealing with, that in the first place may not have ever got to where they were if we'd had proper compliance and enforcement, whether it be wildlife issues, mining issues, forestry issues, and so forth. We know in the budget there's a projected increase in full-time FTE in the public service from 28,900 in 2017-18 to 29,400 in 2018-2019. That's a 500 FY full-time equivalent increase in people in this province. But when we read the details and we learn more about where it is, it's increasing staffing requirements that are there to implement government's childcare and housing initiatives. Of course, we understand that, as well as frontline service positions, including sheriffs, court service staff. Clearly, there's been a problem there. To deliver social assistance services, again, long overdue, and conservation officers, also critical. What I didn't see in language I would have liked to have seen was in climate compliance and enforcement as well, where we have the regulators going out to ensure that our rules are actually being followed, our mining rules. There are good companies, there are companies that are a little loose with the rules, and we end up having situations that if they get out of control, they can taint and brand an entire industry, when in fact it's not the entire industry. If we had been forthcoming in our compliance and enforcement, we might have actually never got to the situation we are in. We also clearly have issues with respect, staff increases required for cannabis legalization. That presumably will be a self-funding increase through income coming from taxation of the cannabis when it comes to play, whenever that will be. Work-safe matters, wildlife recovery efforts, land use planning, and environmental management. There's a lot of I would have loved to have seen the words compliance and enforcement in there, and I'll be seeking to explore that in further detail as we discuss the various bills that arise from this budget in the months ahead. To schools and to post-secondary institutions, the fact that there's substantive investment in schools is good. The fact that there's a substantive investment in post-secondary education and capital spending is good. We've got buildings, we've got the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Engineering building at SFU. That's great. 515 students will benefit that. We've got a new industrial training and tech center at Thompson Rivers. Fantastic. You know, what struck me about this budget, Honourable Speaker? What struck me about this budget is when you look at where the investments are, I could not tell you if they were in a Liberal riding or an NDP riding or Green riding, because they were in all ridings. It was truly an investment that spanned all parts of British Columbia. We have construction of a new heavy-duty mechanics building at College of New Caledonia in Prince George. Clearly not a bastion of an NDP stronghold right now. The two members here are from, for now, it's going to be green in the future, I get that, but for now, it's not. We know, yeah, if people would actually show up to vote. if we go, Nelson, Selkirk, we never had it, I don't bet. We have a renovation and renewal of the trades facilities at Selkirk College in Nelson. This too is important, as we got to recognize here that in fact not everybody needs to go to university. In fact, it's not healthy for a society of people who all go to university. We need to support our trades, our skilled labor that's going to be required as we transition to a low carbon economy, because the number of jobs that we'll see in this transitional economy will be profound. You know, obviously I'm excited from a purely selfish perspective to see that there's a new health sciences center at Camosun College that will house 18 science programs such as community mental health, athletic and exercise therapy, nursing and university transfer health programs. This has been long overdue, but it's not only Victoria, it's also in Vancouver Island University. There's a new health and science center there. We've got capital infrastructure projects in Campbell River, in Dawson Creek, in Okanagan College, Vernon Campus, and on and on and on. Again, in Okanagan, it's the trades facility there that's going to get an injection of funds. At Northern Lights College I've been to and visited, the trades campus replacement will occur. Again, these are not NDP ridings. So again, I commend the NDP on this for recognizing that it's important to represent all British Columbians, not just those people who happen to elect you. And that, to be honest, is quite refreshing. Coming to the healthcare facilities, we also see over the coming 3 years, $3.1 billion of capital spending that will be put forward in terms of healthcare, new hospitals, revising hospitals, and so forth. All of these, of course, we support. We're a little concerned about what this will do to the debt. We'll have to follow that carefully. However, you know, the investments in these areas have been long overdue. Some of these investments clearly will have come from previous governments' commitments to investments in other projects, which may or may not have been deemed as important as these projects here. Almost certainly we would agree with the present approach as opposed to the former approach. To the issue of ICBC, this is where there's a bit of an uncertainty, Honourable Speaker. We see that ICBC is in financial troubles. We could point fingers and blame. It's pretty clear that the present government cannot be blamed. It's pretty clear where blame goes in this, but I don't want to go mired down that. What I want to talk about is ICBC annual net loss results, which are included in the province's fiscal plan and the reported results. The reason why this is important is there's uncertainty embedded in this, because the causes of the losses, like rising injury claims, rising number of crashes, rising cost of minor injuries, emergence of older, large, complex claims, basic rates not covering growing costs, lower investment returns, and capital reserves deterioration are sort of known. But there's a bunch of problems here in terms of knowing to what extent the measures being put forward by government to reform pain and suffering claims, to increase accident benefits, to make sure that more minor claims are reviewed through a civil resolution tribunal, to reduce crashes through steps to be taken on piloting technology to curb distracted driving, and so forth. What is not known is the steps that are being taken, whether or not they will actually deal with the debt that's being incurred. And so the uncertainty in the budget moving forward is to determine how effective these are. Finally, finally in terms of miscellaneous items, we're very pleased. All of these get high marks from us, which is why overall we gave this budget a B+ to an A-, which we can talk about in office hours afterwards, member from Powell River to Sunshine Coast. It's that we have a lot of these smaller issues here. They may seem small from a overall financial investment, but they're critical to the stakeholders and the groups that are being funded. $51 million over 3 years to improve access to justice. That's critical, particularly the 26 million being put to the Legal Services Society for the expansion of legal aid services. Those who can afford to hire lawyers are able to do so. Those who can't deserve access to the judicial system. And we're pleased to see that. And we're pleased particularly to see that 11 million of that is going to support the expansion of Parents Legal Centre, which is consistent with the recommendations of Grand Chief Ed John and his report on Indigenous child welfare. 15 million of that, of course, is going to be added to increase the number of court sheriffs and increase staffing for court services branch. Again, nobody wants to read another story about somebody committing a crime getting off solely because there was no sheriff there to escort that person from where they are to be in the court at the time. It's good to see 10 million going to the Ministry of Attorney General, initiatives that are related to family dispute resolutions and so forth, particularly in the fact that it's increasing digital access to these judicial services in remote and rural communities. So again, 51 million doesn't seem like a lot, but critical in that area. Another area that we completely support and are delighted to see, $18 million over 3 years, and an additional $8 million per year in 2020 to 2021 in the area of women and children affected by violence. Another critical aspect of our society that will benefit greatly from an investment of funds now. This funding will provide support for domestic violence units used to meet demand for programs and services such as counselling, outreach and crisis support for women and children who are experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault and other crimes. In terms of social services, we see $6 million being applied over a period of 3 years to the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction to increase staffing, reduce contact center wait times, and help provide reliable and responsive service. We're hoping, we also see $6 million again, critical, very supportive of this, over 3 years to the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation to increase funding for Aboriginal friendship centres, which play integral roles in terms of ensuring communities are able to have places where they can go and meet and discuss issues that affect them. Small increase, $9 million for conservation service officers. Not one of these many really good things that we apply. One of them that we think is a little bit on the weak side, $5 million to maintain 1,900 campsites. We can do better than that in the province of British Columbia, and I hope we can do better than that as we move forward. $5 million for 1,900 campsites. You know, we want people to experience the beauty of our outdoors because you don't protect and retain that which you don't experience. So we would have hoped to have seen more in that, and hopefully in years ahead we'll see some more. I'm getting assurances, nods from government members, from the one MLA who has all-seeing and all-knowing MLA. It's the member from Powell River, Sunshine Cove. Finally, you know, the Victoria Regional Transport Commission, of which, of course, I live in the broader area, in the Saanich component of that, it will be pleased to know that there's an increase in motor fuel tax rate from 3.5 cents a litre to 5.5 cents a litre to clear Fastline and clear diesel in the CRD to assist in transportation plans that as we move forward. So to conclude, you know, I've spoken a lot, and I recognize some members have been here. Oh, I've got lots more to say. A lot on this issue. Overall, you know, one of the key things that we're supportive of, and one of the reasons why we're quite pleased to support this budget, is that it begins to start to get us on the path of ensuring that intergenerational equity is a guiding principle in our governance. Doesn't go all the way. We still fund healthcare for seniors at a much greater rate than we do fund, for example, issues like childcare, which affect younger families. And we expect the younger families, working families, to pay for through their taxation, pay for the health care, which is being applied typically at the latter part of your life. One of the things I do hope government does is if you actually look at the Canada Health Transfer and you look at what British Columbia gets, we know we're hundreds of millions of dollars in a shortfall directly because the Canada Health Transfer, and I've done this if government's interested, done the calculation. Canada Health Transfer is based on your population. It's not based on your age-weighted population. British Columbia is a destination where people retire. Other jurisdictions like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and elsewhere are places that typically have a younger demographic. People work in these other areas, retire here, they pay taxes in other areas, they retire here. And we also know that healthcare costs increase dramatically as you age. So if you age weight the healthcare, the population in British Columbia, we're owed several $100 million than other provinces are getting, and I hope that there's a continuation of lobbying in this regard. I do know the former minister, Honourable Terry Lake, did bring this up with Ottawa, but I think we could be a little firmer on that, because frankly it's not acceptable the way that people pay taxes elsewhere, we pay their health insurance here. You know, the key issues that affect intergenerational equity are housing, childcare, climate change, environmental management, and something that I'll come to in a second that I believed was missing. Housing, good first steps. Finally, we have a recognition that this is a critical issue. Not sure that the outcomes that are being sought are going to be met by the plans put in place. It appears to be, in summary, that government is viewing as the housing crisis as a way to tax and create revenue to provide housing, affordable housing in another sector, rather than dealing with the problem, which is the offshore capital. Childcare, we have an excellent first step, which, to be blunt, mirrors the community plan, sometimes known as a $10 a day plan, in terms of the priorities, but it ensures that people who need childcare get childcare when they need childcare. Some of the things that aren't embedded in that, we think, are some of the recognition that not everybody wants to put their childcare. Climate change, I have great confidence and faith in the Minister of Environment, but I hope that we actually start to develop the plan as we move forward and start to implement policy measures. I look forward to working him, because dealing with this is not a big stick. It's not a big, huge challenge. It's an opportunity, an incredible opportunity, which I'll come to in a second. So the budget takes us some of the way to these issues, very far towards dealing with these issues in the case of childcare. But ultimately, it's not fundamentally rooted in the principle and isn't bold enough to achieve lasting change for future generations. What I would argue, Honourable Speaker, what I would argue is lacking in this budget is a step-back vision of the direction this province needs to head. The budget focuses largely on fixing many of the problems that have been created over the last 16 years as we went down one path. Now, I recognize, and my colleagues recognize, that there needs to be some checks and balances to fix a lot of this stuff. But there isn't a longer-term vision. Again, we didn't want a vision of hope grounded in a fallacy of LNG, a vision of hope grounded in what we are good at. The previous government rattled on incessantly about 100,000 jobs, a $100 billion prosperity fund, a $1 trillion increase in GDP, elimination of PSD, thriving schools and hospitals. Those unicorns in all our backyards, literally each and every one of us would be happy and have Maseratis and great, and we're all happy, but not because of LNG. And the government, in sending that signal, that was their vision. It was a vision that was desperate. It was a Hail Mary pass, an election campaign that nobody thought they would win. They caught the touchdown. They tried to deliver the impossible. The result is colossal failure. The result is 4.5 years of sitting there in a timeout. So the member from Prince George Valemount is laughing. And I just like to point to the issue that the former Minister of Natural Gas told me. Wow, we've switched speakers twice since I've been talking here. The manager, the member from Prince George Valemount was laughing, but I like to remind members in this House of the sage words of the former Minister of Natural Gas and Housing. The Minister of Natural Gas and Housing told me I knew not what for which I was talking, and that he was much smarter than everyone else in this House because he knew what corporations were, and he was looking forward to coming to dinner where I would have to eat my words because he knew what was going to happen. Well, that was in 2015, and here we are in 2018, and the only words I've eaten, well, I haven't eaten any words. But the fact that this minister has the gall, former minister, has the gall and the audacity to come to this House and still talk about natural gas is mind-boggling. Honestly, if there was justice in this society, the member from Langley East would resign. He would resign because he failed. He failed as a very serious failure because he sent this province in a direction that misled Terrace, Kitimat, It created people in northern British Columbia who invested in creation of hotels. The people who invested in hotels in Terrace that are empty. People who invested in new housing in Kitimat that's empty. People who've been told this, that, and the other that we're all going to get LNG are empty. Those people in education systems across British Columbia who were told that they better start preparing for the LNG economy and trade all these people to deliver LNG were failed. This is a colossal failure of public policy in British Columbia, which is the reason why this government needs to sit in timeout for a full 4.5 years as they rediscover who they are and what they stand for, because LNG did not happen, will not happen, and frankly, I was the only person in this legislature since 2012 pointing out the fiscal folly of sending a signal to market that was so irresponsible that it actually lost opportunities in British Columbia that we could now be leaders in. We recognize in the budget, in the throne speech that we discussed earlier, there's an investment in the economy of tomorrow. But I would have liked to see a vision of that economy. The vision of economy that recognizes that British Columbia needs to build on our strategic... Do the member opposite, do I talk to the tech sector? I have talked to more CEOs in the tech sector, member, than probably most of your caucus have done collectively over the past 4 years.
Members.
But that's okay.
Members.
That's okay.
Members. Member for Oakville Gordon Head has the floor. Please
it's
continue.
Wonderful that the Liberals got all feisty here. It's about time. So the member opposite, who's talking about have you talked to the tech sector today, if this government actually, when they're talking about what's going on in this legislature, had 1/2 ounce of credibility and actually spoke truth in terms of what they're saying, instead of talking about a jobs tax, rhetoric about a jobs tax, instead of claiming that somehow a dinner on Bowen Island led to an $800 million loss of shareholders' values, when they're looking at the wrong stock. They're looking at KMI on the New York Stock Exchange, which is Kinder Morgan International, whereas KML, which is the Trans Mountain stock in Canada, actually did the opposite. This is the kind of rhetoric we have here in the province of British Columbia, and this is why we have the tension that exists in our society, because the BC Liberals care not for the people of British Columbia, they care about their own political aspirations and their desire and quest to get into power no matter what. They'll say anything, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, they'll sell anything to anybody, and truth be gotten out the window, because all they care about is power, and it's quite shameful that this is the way they are.
Members will come to order.
Speaker, Honourable Speaker, Honourable Speaker, Honourable Speaker, Honourable Speaker, again, I have sat in this question period for nearly 2 weeks, or more than 2 weeks, I have yet to hear a question, apart from today, credit to the few questions at the end of the day, substantive questions on housing from the members opposite. Nothing. Questions on childcare and mental health. Nothing. We get questions, it's all about the gotcha politics. All about the gotcha politics, because what matters is the quest for power. What matters, in the words of the leader of the official opposition, is that he get under the skin of the government and that he drive a wedge between the BC Greens and the BC NDP, because that's what he thinks his job is. No, Honourable Speaker, no. His job and this opposition's job is to serve the people of British Columbia and ensure that their interests are actually represented, not their petty power requests, but the people of British Columbia. Bring the issues forward, like the member from Caribou North did. The member from Caribou did. A critical issue about...
Members. Member, please pause. Members, we all know that moderation and temperance are the hallmark of parliamentary debate. Let's keep it going. Thank you, member. Please proceed.
Thank you. My only wish is that Hansard is able to record the banter coming from opposite, because it would be quite delightful. As we move forward, my comments will be on Hansard. No, there's no doubt about that. Coming back to the end of the vision I would like to see is a vision that actually defined where we should head based on the strengths of British Columbia. What do we have in British Columbia that no one else in the world has? We are the most beautiful province to live in Canada. One of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful places in the world to live in. We know that that's a strategic strength. We have one of the top education systems in the world, right the way from K all the way through advanced and post-secondary education, and up soon in terms of ECE and childcare as well with this new investment. That is a strategic strength, and if you don't believe me, you just have to go to the international PISA assessments, where BC ranks #1 in the top 10 in all issues, top of Canada. We know that we have that as a strategic strength. We know that we have a strategic strength in terms of the access to unbounded energy, renewable energy, unbounded fiber in terms of wood, and unbounded access to water. These are strategic strengths of our geographic location. So rather than trying to chase the weaknesses of others, we need to recognize these strengths. And there are sub-strengths in regions that I'll come to. What does that mean? What does that mean is that rather than thinking that somehow we will compete in a global market by racing to the bottom, by throwing out any internalization of any externalities, by doing things at the cheapest possible way, by cutting social programs, that's not how we're going to compete. We know we'll never compete with Indonesia. We'll never compete with a jurisdiction in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of digging dirt out of the ground. The reason why we won't compete is because we do have environmental values and social values here in British Columbia that we believe is important to internalize, that are lesser important in other jurisdictions. That's the way for us to compete, rather than chase to the bottom, which the BC Liberals tried to do with their reckless approach to LNG. We need to be smarter. We need to bring our tech sector together with our resource sector to actually ensure that we are, when we extract our resources, we do so in a smarter, more efficient way, because efficiency is where we're going to get it, efficiency in cleaner ways. That's why companies like MindSense, BC-based companies, need our support as they bring new technologies right to the rock face, which we can allow us to actually compete in the extraction of resources, as well as the selling of secondary resources. This is why we should be looking like a place like Terrace. Terrace in British Columbia. What is the strategic strength of Terrace? It's on a rail line, Honourable Speaker, a rail line between Prince Rupert, the gateway to Asia with an amazing deep-water port there, and Chicago, the gateway to eastern U.S. We seem to think what Terrace should be is a service center for a non-existent LNG port in Kitimat. But no, what Terrace can recognize as strategic strength is we should be getting the companies like BMW, who set up shop in Washington, to build their factories in Terrace, where they have access to the rest of the world, where they have access to a stable, skilled workforce that they can attract and retain because of the quality of environment that we can offer and the quality of life we can offer. And we can offer them access to boundless clean energy, which will allow them to brand themselves as a company of the 21st century, a clean company, which so many are doing. But that wasn't the thinking of the BC Liberals. $10 million investment would have allowed broadband redundancy into the city of Prince George to allow companies like Google to come up there and not beholden to a single carrier that owns all broadband access into that region. Government abdicated its responsibility for 16 years to actually bring broadband into communities across British Columbia because government in the past seemed to think it is solely in the hands of the multinationals to bring in broadband. Government had no problem building roads and highways, thinking that we need to get people from A to B, but couldn't think beyond this 20th century, early 20th century thinking. And instead didn't think about information highways, bringing broadband to rural communities across British Columbia, which is why I'm excited to see that here in the budget, because government does have a role there in the information highway. And when you do that, you start to make our resource sector, bringing together with a tech sector, we start to be competitive if we send a signal to market that this is the direction we want our society to go. We want our society to go down to a sustainable, resilient 21st century economy, not the way that the BC Liberals want, not to chase back to the 20th century, not to go back to becoming hewers of wood and drawers of water. And if I hear one more time from the BC Liberals that somehow they are stewards of rural BC, I think I'm going to stand up and scream, because the reality is Northern BC is hurting right now, Honourable Speaker. Northern BC is hurting because of reckless fiscal policies of the BC Liberals for the last 16 years. If you go to Northern BC, Honourable Speaker, go to Fort Nelson, you'll find that the dry gas fields are dried up there. What was their plan? Nothing. We have timber lot licenses owned by the multinationals that are not being accessed. We can't even have the city of Fort Nelson heating its own town through a biomass facility is there because of regulations put in place by this government. We are in the situation we are in because of their policies. Finally, Honourable Speaker, after 16 years, we have a government working together in a minority situation with people people who want to actually make the economy start to thrive in the north, make the economy want to thrive in the industry, recognizing that value added is the way forward, recognizing that we have successes like Structurlam in Penticton, we have successes in the agri-food industry, we have successes across British Columbia that this former government was so unconcerned with that they threw them under the bus as all they talked about was LNG. LNG. Jobs, 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 LNG. It's like cheerleaders. If I had given them pom-poms, Honourable Speaker, they would be shaking the pom-poms with LNG, LNG, rah, rah, and nothing. 16 years of this. 16 years of this, Honourable Speaker. Thank goodness we have a budget. Thank goodness we have a budget, finally, that puts people first, that recognizes that prosperity is local, that recognizes that British Columbia can be innovators, British Columbians are innovators, and that this budget will actually lead to a better BC across British Columbia, and we can assure you that that is change that you can count on. Thank you.